Greetings, science students. Well, in this clip, we are reviewing the work we covered, firstly on the cardiovascular system, and then we moved into the respiratory system. I am reviewing 4 weeks worth of work, so this will be a lengthy clip. We started this unit of work by looking at the level of organisation in the cell to organism hierarchy. So starting with the cells, the building blocks of life, we looked at red blood cells, white blood cells, etc. And when we get some of these cells that are woven together to perform a specific function, we called it this tissue, such as muscle tissue. Collectively, tissue forms organs, and these organs perform a specific function, such as the heart and the lungs, which featured in the 2 organ systems that we've covered. When we have multiple organs working together to perform a complex function, such as the heart and lungs in the circulatory system, we call this an organ system. So when we look at this question here, the roles of the circulatory system, let's break down those 2 terms. We've got a system of multiple organs that are working together to perform a complex task, in this case, circulation. So in terms of the roles, we're transporting oxygen and nutrients to the cells that need those oxygen and nutrients to function. We're picking up the waste, carbon dioxide, so we can transport that back to the respiratory system. We're also removing waste that we need to get rid of. And we're also distributing heat around the body so it can best function. Then we get to the 3 main components of the circulatory system. So first of all, we need the highways, the streets, our vessels, made up of our arteries, veins, and capillaries. More about them later. And then we have the main organ where a lot of the action is occurring for the circulatory system in terms of pumping that blood out to the heart and the lungs. And then we have the fluid, the blood. More about that again later. These are our 3 major components. So in terms of the type of blood vessels, I'll park capillaries for a tick. Let's just look at the dichotomy, the opposites between the 2 major blood vessels in terms of the arteries and the veins. So on the right here, we've got an image, cross-section of the artery and the veins. We looked at this in the microscope task. And if we look at these walls for our arteries, we've got the thick walls with a small opening, the lumen, and that's because we're pumping out the blood under high pressure, so we need a lot of musculature in those arteries. We don't need that wide lumen, as opposed to the veins, thinner walls, less musculature, so we need a much larger lumen because that blood is pumped out under a lower degree of pressure. And because of that lack of pressure, we need some valves to prevent the backflow in our veins. Because of the high pressure in our arteries, we don't need the veins because of those walls literally pulsing so that we can get that blood moving in a linear direction. Key point though is that our arteries are carrying blood from the heart that's oxygenated to the cells, and the blood that's being transported back to the heart is deoxygenated. It's come from the cells picking up that carbon dioxide. And then we have the smallest and most abundant type of blood vessel, the capillaries, which have the direct line of communication with the cells, which we'll illustrate later when we look at the gas exchange that occurs with the alveoli in the lungs. Now let's focus on the 4 chambers of the heart. So keep in mind that blood enters the heart in the atrium and blood exits the heart via the ventricles, up out here and up out here. So the deoxygenated blood that has come from the cells will enter the right atrium of the heart via the vena cava, and once that fills up, it will then enter into the right ventricle, and then when that fills up, a big push will basically send that blood out the pulmonary artery to the lungs. The lungs will oxygenate that blood, and then it will enter its second lap of the heart via the pulmonary vein into the left atrium. When that fills up, it will then go into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle, the most muscular part of your heart, which hopefully you felt with the pinch test on our dissection. Then a big push from the left ventricle will push that oxygenated blood out the aorta, which will reach all the cells of the body. So some more dichotomy to be mindful of. And again, dichotomy means opposites. So when the blood is entering the right side of the heart, it's deoxygenated because it's coming from the cells. And it only needs a thick wall in that right ventricle because we don't need to pump it very far to the lungs, as opposed to the blood that enters the left side of the heart that's just come back from the lungs. It's been oxygenated through that gas exchange, and the thick walls in the left ventricle will push that blood under great force so it can get to all of the cells in the body. Before we get into the 4 valves that feature in the heart, let's just broadly look at the function of those valves. So when blood enters any of the chambers, it will create pressure once that chamber is filled. That pressure will cause the valve to open in one direction so that the blood can then move from that chamber. So if we look at the right side, the oxygen poor blood that's come from the cells enters the right atrium, and once that's filled, that will force the tricuspid valve to open up so that that blood can then move into the right ventricle. On the left side, the blood has entered the heart from the lungs, so it's oxygen rich, and once that left atrium is filled, that will create pressure which will force the mitral valve to open up so we can pour that blood into the left ventricle. If we go back, if we stay on the left side, once that left ventricle is filled, the most muscular part of the heart, the walls of the left ventricle, will basically create a big push, forcing the blood up and out through the aortic valve so that that blood can be directed to all the cells of the body. Back to the right side of the heart, when blood has moved into the right ventricle and the ventricle fills, that pressure will force the walls to basically contract, and we'll have that blood that will exit the lungs via the pulmonary valve right here to the lungs. So earlier we mentioned that blood is one of the 3 major components of the circulatory system, along with the vessels and the heart itself. And the blood has an array of jobs, which we've already touched on in terms of the transportation of the gases, the nutrients, the waste, etc., made up of the red and white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. Specifically, it's the red blood cells being circulated through the blood vessels, where we have hemoglobin carrying those oxygen atoms and nutrients to the cells, and then picking up the carbon dioxide and the waste that we can transport back to the lungs. Your white blood cells, they play a key role in our immune response by attacking and destroying germs. The platelets, well, they basically form plugs, so when we get a surface cut, particularly on a capillary, so that we can prevent that blood loss. And the plasma, the most abundant part of the blood, proportionally, which basically helps maintain the pressure of the blood so it can circulate through the arteries, veins, and the capillaries, and also contains some pretty important nutrients. And back to the red blood cells, it's the hemoglobin, which gives red blood cells that red tinge that contains iron, and its job is simply to carry those oxygen molecules to the cells that need that oxygen and the nutrients in order to function. Before we get into the 8 blood groups, we need a very basic understanding of antigens and antibodies. So antigens physically attach to the red blood cells. Antibodies just swim in the plasma. And there's an opposite effect in terms of the blood groups. So if you have A antigens attached to your red blood cells, you're going to have the B antibodies. And opposite, if you have B antigens, you'll have A antibodies. If you have neither, you'll have both type of antibodies. And if you have both the A and B antigen, you'll have neither type of antibody. This creates a few deal breakers in terms of blood transfusions, because if we have a B antibody, that would attack a B antigen. They're not mates. So therefore, if you have a blood type A, you will not be able to receive a B type blood transfusion. Now, in terms of the 8 type of blood groups, you can have an A antigen, which we've got here. You can have a B, you can have both, or you can have neither. In terms of the pos and neg, it's got to do with a third type of antigen, the resus one. So all of these minuses here don't have that resus antigen. All of these positives do. And that's how we get the classification of our 8 types of blood groups. Now, in terms of blood donors, you won't be expected to memorize this chart, but just be mindful that there might be a question on who's the best type of donor and why. So if we look at this column here, O neg, the great thing about O neg donors is because they don't have any A or B antigens, we don't have to worry about the antibodies there, and likewise with the resus. So therefore, if you are the recipient in need of blood, then you can always get any type of blood type can receive a donation from an O neg. If we look at these B donors, well, because of the A antigens, that means that we can't receive them if we're an A pos or an A neg. And same with these A ones here, because of their B antibodies, that rules out our Bs. So on the test, the main thing to understand here is that O neg is the best type of donor, because for that they will basically satisfy the criteria for any type of recipient. All of the cells in the body need oxygen, and they also need energy in order to function. And this is where cellular respiration comes into play. So when we get some glucose and oxygen in the relevant organelle in our cells, these are our reactants in our worded equation here. Chemical reaction occurs and we get our products on the right. Now, our carbon dioxide and our water, they're waste products, but the money is the energy in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So it's the production of this ATP that is integral for the functionality and survival of the cells in our body. And the cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cells that you learned a fair bit about in year 7. All right, let's get into the respiratory system. So as we inhale air, it enters both our mouth and our nasal cavity, travels down the pharynx. We've got our voice box here, the larynx, through our trachea, and then we branch off into the bronchi and basically into our smaller bronchioles until we reach the air sacs, the alveoli. So let's just revisit that and zoom in a bit. So when we inhale, the air has reached the trachea, and then half of it will go left, half of it will go right by the bronchus, which is plural for bronchi, and then it'll basically branch out into these bronchioles. And it's through these bronchioles that we reach the 600 million air sacs, the alveoli, circulated in your heart, which gives it its spongy mass. Now, when you're describing the functionality of the alveoli, a buzzword that you want to refer to is diffusion. So diffusion is simply where we have gases exchanging through thin one-cell thick walls, where we have carbon dioxide moving from one side of that wall to the other, and oxygen moving to the other side. This image beautifully highlights the diffusion process. So we've inhaled some air, it's gone down the trachea, bronchi, bronchioli, it reaches the air sac, and then it diffuses across the 1-cell thick wall into a capillary and hops on to a red blood cell. Now that red blood cell has some carbon dioxide that it needs to offload. So that carbon dioxide will also diffuse across that 1-cell thick membrane into the air sac. And now through exhaling, we can remove that carbon dioxide out our nose and out our mouth. So we're in the home stretch now. We're just going to finish off with the mechanics of breathing. So you don't need to memorize the exact numbers here, but just be mindful that when we're relaxed, we're breathing about every 3 to 5 seconds, as opposed to our heart rate, which is more rapid. That's beating slightly more than once a second when we're relaxed. The two major muscles involved in the mechanics of breathing are our external, internal, intercostal muscles. I'm not going to worry about differentiating those, and importantly, our diaphragm. So when we breathe in, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles contract, and as a result of that, our rib cage moves up and out, and the volume of our lungs has expanded. There's more room in there, and that reduces the air pressure, which is kind of a bad thing. So therefore, we need to breathe in to get more air into the lungs to equalize that pressure. Then our diaphragm and our intercostal muscles relax. And as a result of that, the rib cage gets smaller and the volume of our lungs decreases. So we've got all of that air trapped in this tight space, which creates a lot of pressure. So therefore that forces us to exhale so we can get rid of some of that air and again equalize the pressure of our lungs. This is the final slide. Just be mindful that the air we breathe is a mixture of gases. It's a mixture because we can separate them. It's predominantly nitrogen. Our cells can't use nitrogen, so that literally enters the lungs, exits the lungs through the inhaling, exhaling process. It's the oxygen. So even though it's only a minor gas, pretty important in terms of the functionality of our cells.